All right. Well, everybody, it is great to have you for another CSL Fireside chat here. This is always super popular because many of you, I think pretty much all the students who are in here, we do have some guests from the Corporate Startup Lab, corporate attendees as well. But for all the students who are in here, you use Alex's tools in your lean entrepreneurship class and the startup marketing class. So this is the man behind the business model canvas that all of you guys have been using to organize your thoughts on your startups over the semester here. So we're going to jump in with Alex talking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and do some Q&A. So please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to queue up questions for us. I also just wanted to make one plug. If you have not yet registered for our Corporate Entrepreneurship Forum on November 16th, go to corporatestartuplab.com and you can register for the forum there. Alex has spoken the last 2 years at the forum when it was virtual. Obviously, he's based in Europe, so this is also kind of a chance to preview some of his stuff heading into the forum as well. But with that, I will hand it over to Alex. Alex, I think, again, is known by all of you guys. This is not a person that you're not familiar with, but one of the deepest thinkers in business and strategy, created the business model canvas that many of you use. And then you can see the books up on his screen behind him that he's continued to contribute to as part of the group strategizer, and then continues to be highly ranked in the Thinkers50 year after year after year at this point. Other folks in that you guys know as well, like Rita McGrath is part of that list as well. So some good company there as well. But Alex, I will hand it over to you to kind of open us up with some remarks, and then about 30 minutes from now, we'll jump into some Q&A. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for getting us started, Sean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to a couple of slides. I'll sketch out a couple of things. I'll try to stick to something like 30 minutes. I want to do one or two little exercises as well. So I want you to grab something to draw, which could be a tablet, but much better if it's a paper, pencil, paper, pen. I'm going to get you doing an exercise on business model innovation a little bit later on. Just to frame this, I like to call companies that are able to innovate all the time invincible companies. Very arrogant title, but it basically just means that you can only become invincible if you actually believe you're not invincible, right? So that means a company that is able to constantly reinvent itself, and not necessarily limited just to companies, right? Government institutions, the same thing. But then in particular, also compete on superior business models and reinvent the business model or business models all the time. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. And then the last one, the hardest, actually, for companies to transcend industry boundaries, to not think, oh, we're in the car industry, we're in the news industry, in banking or in pharma, but to break out of that. And we obviously know that you take companies like Amazon or Apple or Microsoft, they've transcended industry boundaries already, but we're seeing the same phenomena happening in pharmaceutical companies as well. If we had written the book, during the pandemic, we probably would have called it The Resilient Company. So companies that are able to reinvent themselves, compete on superior business models, and transcend industry boundaries are much more resilient than traditional companies. Now, talking about innovation and growth, there's this BCG report by Boston Consulting Group that shows that most companies, 75%, rank innovation as a top 3 priority. It's in the strategy stuff, every leader needs to think about innovation. But here's the interesting thing in this study. There's a huge contrast between the ambition, 75%, say it's important, and 20% of companies, according to BCG, are able to scale innovation. So there's this huge gap between ambition and reality. So I want to talk very quickly about 3 things. Why is this? Because there's a gap between exploit and explore, because we don't really necessarily understand what business models are yet, and because most companies don't understand business model portfolios. So let me start with this very basic topic, the ambidextrous organization. How do you exploit and explore at the same time? Everybody talks about it, and very few companies are actually able to do this. Now, why is this so hard? Because in the startup world, when you have an idea, you see a market opportunity, you go out, you search, experiment, you move really, really fast until you have a business model and value proposition that can scale. That's when you start to scale, and then you become a company and you manage that organization. Now, this first part is very messy and very hard to kind of orchestrate. It's the domain of entrepreneurship and innovation. And the part on the right-hand side is really more about managing once you've scaled a company. It's what I like to call explore and exploit. And most companies, once they're beyond the startup phase, they get really, really good at managing the existing, exploiting the existing. Let's say 99% of the energy, or 95, goes into this. And, even startups very quickly forget how to explore, because they get so focused on growing the business and then better managing the business that they kind of forget how to explore. So that's the framing. And I want to draw here very quickly how they differ. So when we go, and this is fundamental to understanding business model innovation, when we go from idea to a real business, traditionally, people used to make business plans, right, with curves that go like this. But the process of innovation and entrepreneurship is very messy. You go forward, you regress, you make mistakes. And if you make it, rest in peace, all good ideas, it's really hard to get over here. If you make it, well, you're probably pretty tired when you arrive. But here's the thing, that because this process is so messy and we don't know what's going to work, we shouldn't write business plans, but we should actually do something else. We should admit that risk and uncertainty is very high when you start with an idea or a market opportunity. And your only task in exploration is to reduce risk and uncertainty. How do you do that? With small experiments first. So maybe talking to customers, right? Figuring out what they're struggling with, learning that you were probably very wrong, and constantly learn more and more, reduce the uncertainty, and do that with experiments that get more and more expensive. So first you might talk with people, later on when you know more, you make digital prototypes, but the investment only goes up when you have evidence. So it's the contrary of exploit, because in exploit, you look at on plan, on budget, the world is less uncertain, you make big investments to expand the supply chain, etc. So the KPIs here is measuring the evidence that we have. And at any point in time, you ask, should I kill this project or should I continue to invest? So that's a very different world here, exploit and explore. So we need to deeply, deeply understand that. And the last thing I want to introduce talking about exploit, explore is that there are different types of innovation. So efficiency innovation is pretty close to managing the existing. You improve your processes. Sustaining innovation, new products, value proposition, channels, already a little bit harder, right? Because we're now talking about more uncertainty. Do I know if the customers want this? Not sure. Do I know the customer? It's new customer segment. And then we have the business model innovation. So it's a whole spectrum. And the best companies are actually good at all three of these. It's not either or. So that's this whole challenge of exploit and explore. So that's the first big thing, hard thing for companies to manage. Now, let me go into business models. And as Sean already said, probably many of you kind of know the business model canvas that you can use in this process to go from idea to a scalable business model. Let me dive into the process for a second before I get into business models. There's this first aspect, which is business design, thinking really hard about great value propositions and great business models. And mainly this means thinking beyond the business models you already know in an industry. So what does that require? Typical kind of ideation, but then prototyping the business model, assessing the design qualities. Recurring revenues, very good. Transactional revenues, not so good. Very scalable business model, good. Not so scalable business model, not so good. And we don't master this part well enough. So we'll get to testing in a second. That's a whole different universe. But even this part, the universe of potential new business models, we don't master really well. And many of you know, we invented these tools, the business model canvas, to prototype a business model, and the value proposition canvas to prototype a value proposition. Why? Because it's really important to come up with better business models. So when we started doing this work with companies and startups around the world, we realized they're actually not so good at thinking business model. Everybody's technology and product focused. So what if we came up with this idea of patterns? Like you have software or design patterns, what if we came up with business model patterns to help people think through better business models? Okay, so what if we took this idea of patterns, which is basically, it comes from software, right? And architecture and design in general, a repeatable configuration, in this case, of different business model building blocks. So not an entire business model, just a pattern. And we applied this to the business model canvas, said, well, the different types of patterns, front stage, is all about the customer, value propositions, customer segments, channels. So patterns related to the front stage, this yellow part. Then maybe patterns related to the backstage. How do we configure activities? Let's do this in a new way. Think IKEA, right? Flat packing. So backstage disruption with patterns related to doing things differently behind the scenes. And then we have the profit formula disruption, where we rethink how we make money and how we spend money. So we find better ways to generate a profit. Think, low-cost airlines. They didn't just say, oh, we're going to make it cheap. They had to reconfigure the whole business model to be able to create a different kind of profit formula. So let's look at one example and go quickly through this, and then I'll do an exercise. So if we take front stage disruption, I'll just go and zoom into one block. I'll take this block of the channels. What do these three business models have in common? So type into the chat window, Dollar Shave Club. So this online shaving website where you can buy razor blades. Tupperware, the Tupperware parties from the 50s where entrepreneurial housewives would sell to other friends these plastic containers when they were just starting to become popular. Or Nespresso, the Swiss coffee company that made single portion espresso popular around the world. What do they have in common? Type into the chat window. I don't know if we have chat enabled. Looks like
I think we can use the Q&A window for this, Alex. That's probably our best bet at the moment. So type it into the Q&A, guys, and then I can just mark them as answered.
Okay, that doesn't matter, right? So I'll go right to the answer then. Basically, all of these three examples are channel kings. They have a direct and strong access to customers. And in the case of Dollar Shave Club and Tupperware, but also Nespresso, they actually disrupted the industry by creating new ways of accessing customers. So all these cases, they radically changed how to reach and acquire a large number of customers. So let's look at the pattern here. What's the pattern? So just three parts of the business model. And most important here is value proposition for customers with a very innovative direct channel. Okay, new way of doing things, better business model than the business model that was there before. And the example I like to use, since I mentioned it, is Dollar Shave Club. Why? Because they did something pretty crazy, which, now seems kind of trivial in the age of TikTok, but back when they started out was not so trivial. So what they did is start disintermediating the whole kind of shaving, selling of shaving utensils by going direct, cutting out the middleman, the retailers, and acquiring customers with viral videos. So you probably have seen this. I'll show it to you again, just because it's an interesting thing. The business model doesn't actually matter. It's an illustration of the pattern, which I want to show you. So let's have a look at Dollar Shave Club here, how they made this online store, a really strong, of course, it's not a new model, but really strong access to customers. So let's have a quick look at how they started out.
I'm Mike, founder of DollarShaveClub.com. What is DollarShaveClub.com? Well, for $1 a month, we send high-quality razors right to your door. Yeah, $1. Are the blades any good? No. Our blades are great. Each razor has stainless steel blades, an aloe vera lubricating strip, and a pivot head. It's so gentle a toddler could use it. And do you like spending $20 a month on brand name razors? 19 go to Roger Federer. I'm good at tennis. Do you think your razor needs a vibrating handle, a flashlight, a back scratcher, and 10 blades? Your handsome-ass grandfather had 1 blade and polio. Looking good, pop up. Stop paying for shave tech you don't need. And stop forgetting to buy your blades every month. Alejandro and I are going to ship them right to you. We're not just selling razors, we're also making new jobs. Alejandro, what were you doing last month?
Not working.
What are you doing now?
Working.
I'm no Vanderbilt, but this train makes hay. So stop forgetting to buy your blades every month and start deciding where you're going to stack all those dollar bills I'm saving you. We are dollarshaveclub.com, and the party is on.
So again, the example here doesn't really matter, right? It's about thinking about the patterns. So how could you copy what they did into your industry? And that's the beauty of business model patterns. You can copy business models from anywhere. That's why I like historic examples. So this is kind of historic, but I like going back to business models like the Xerox photocopying machine. So what we want to look at here is the pattern of going direct as a channel king. So affordable men's shaving products sold through the online stores, so nothing revolutionary there. But of course, you can't just put an online store online and expect people to show up. So their strategy was to go, work with viral videos. You'd say, well, is it viral if you can actually predict if they're going to succeed? Well, that's a key competence then, a key activity that they had to develop. So this direct relationship then helped them actually improve the products themselves, and through now recurring revenues. So we moved away from transactional revenues. The whole industry in razor blades was built on transactional sales with a little bit of switching costs because you're using the same kind of model to a subscription model, right? Pretty interesting. But of course, you can't just decide to do that, cut out the middleman, the retailers, without working on building that brand. And in their case, this innovative marketing was built on viral videos, investing heavily into that and making it a core competence and building the brand around that. So we're not showing, or I'm not showing you the full business model. I'm just showing part of the business model here related to becoming a channel king. A business that disrupted the industry to a certain extent, which was a very established industry with established players that used retail, and they came in, built a very strong, different business model based on a longer term relationship with an extremely high retention rate and better product experience because they were going direct. So again, the business model is not revolutionary. It's a pattern that I wanted to illustrate. And then it was acquired by Unilever and for $1 billion. A couple of years ago, this would probably be worth more. But what I want you to take away from this is there was a pattern, okay? Part of this business model can be captured, can be codified, and you can ask questions related to this codified aspect. So in this case, we would ask, do we have large scale and ideally direct access to our end customer? So we're asking a question to assess the business model to see if it is a channel king or not. If you have large scale and direct access to your end customer, you can give yourself a high score. So good design. If your business model doesn't have direct access to customers, you depend on retailers, don't know your customer, you're probably more on a -3. So really interesting, because now we can ask, for each one of the business model building blocks, we can ask a question like that. What does that allow us to do to improve the design of our business model by thinking of patterns? We call this questions for leaders. These are the questions you need to ask as a team, but also as a business leader, you're asking your teams, you're asking them, could there be a way to improve either a business model that's being prototyped or even an existing business unit? That's what I call business design, okay? Now, that was a lot of talking. Let me do a quick exercise. And anybody who's not doing this exercise, is going to miserably fail in your next innovation attempt. So I need to jinx it a bit so you get into working. I want you to take a piece of paper, a tablet, and a pen, and I'm going to do a very quick exercise. It's going to be 2 times 5 seconds, so I need you to get ready. It's a drawing exercise, super simple drawing exercise. And it's going to illustrate why business model innovation is so hard and why we need to think patterns. Okay, hope everybody's ready. Sean, I hope you have something to
I'm ready.
To scribble as well. Good.
I'm ready.
Okay. So if you please draw me in 5 seconds, in 5 seconds, a small house. In 5 seconds, I want you to draw a small house. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop. There's a second exercise now. You have your little house. I want you to decorate the house and the surroundings. Okay, draw on the house and the surroundings to decorate it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop. Now, I wonder how many of you have drawn something like this, maybe even with a small tree, with a tree beside it, probably something like this with a tree beside it. Most people draw this. I do this exercise around the world. Doesn't matter if it's in Asia, South America, in Africa. This is the drawing you get. So why is that? Because we have a mental model of a small house. And what happens when it comes to business models, when we work in a certain arena, a certain industry, or even a certain type of business, we have these mental models of how the business model should look like. That is the biggest barrier to business model innovation. So what we really need to be able to do is to take this small house, crumple it up, throw it away, in order to think what could be, which business models could we create, and which business models would be better for our industry, for this opportunity, for this technology. And that's where the technology is not sufficient. You need to think business model patterns. And if you deeply master business models, could actually be the difference between a $10 million business and a $100 million business, because you thought recurring revenues from the start. Because the technology is not the differentiator often. It's the business model that's going to make you those superior profits. So from the start, we need to be able to think business model. And in the most extreme cases, let me give you a silly example here. When Xerox invented the first modern day photocopying machine, that machine was so expensive that they couldn't sell it. So they had to come up with a new business model, like getting people to lease the machine and then pay per photocopy to actually make it a viable business. If they had tried to sell the photocopying machine, which was the common model back then, this technology would have never seen the light of day, at least not immediately, because the technology was too expensive. So in some cases, you have to think new business models. And I'll give you a last one before I go into business model portfolios. Think the pharmaceutical industry. Today, you have cures that are a one-time injection. Now think of that. If you're a pharmaceutical company and you've been earning money from medication that patients use over 2 decades to keep them alive, that's a lot of revenue stream, right? But now you found a one injection cure. You have an ethical problem. You want to bring that new cure to market, but you're going to kill 2 decades of revenues. So if you ask for a price that brings you in the same amount of money in 1 year, in one cure, in one injection, well, you're probably going to have a huge public outcry because nobody's going to let you ask for that price. So you have really, really serious business model innovation challenges today. Okay, now, last thing I want to go into in the next 5-6 minutes is this idea of business model portfolios. So established companies, they don't have one business model, they have a portfolio of business models, but even more importantly, is when you're exploring new business models, it's not enough to invest in one. Well, we do, have the lean startup method for that because we test and adapt. So Steve Blank, grandfather of the lean startup method and inventor of the customer development process, at the origin of the lean startup movement, says there's a fine line between vision and hallucination. So you need to know which ideas you can invest in and which ideas you need to kill. So that's where we get to the second circle, where red one is design as if we were right, and the yellow one is test as if we were wrong. So I'll give you a silly example where it didn't work out. Better Place was this idea of an electric vehicle with a battery swapping capability. You drive into this battery swapping station, swap the battery, and you go right back out. Biggest pain solved. So great idea. They had a great business plan. Great CEO is Shai Agassi, but it failed because the vision turned out to be a hallucination and they burnt $850 million. And the battery swapping stations look like this now. This is a real one from Denmark that when I gave a talk, the person sent this to me and said, this is how the Better Place looks like now today in Denmark. So I don't want to make fun of Better Place, but they used the most expensive experiment of all, building the thing, okay? So that's unfortunately what companies often do because they invest in spreadsheets. So Scott Cook, co-founder and chairman of Intuit, likes to say for every one of their failures, they had a beautiful spreadsheet that looks awesome. So of course we need to test, but more than that, so testing process looks like this. We test as if we're wrong, hypothesis, experiments, we learn from the experiments. And then based on what we learned, we either go back to the drawing board, we go back into the red one, or we go through the yellow one. But that's not enough. That's not enough. When you're not a startup, you need to do an additional thing. And I wanted to do this in the last couple of minutes, give you a real case from Germany. Bosch, big engineering company, 400,000 people. They went into business model innovation. And this gentleman here, Yves Pigneur, built up the Bosch Accelerator program that allowed them to explore new business models. Now, every company has an accelerator or incubator, but not all of them do things right. So let's listen to Yves ask us a question, and then we'll listen to his answer, because there's certain things you need to understand when you build these kind of business model accelerators. So let's listen to Yves.
Hi there, my name is Yves Pigneur. I'm from Bosch Management Consulting. I'm partner for Business Model Innovation, and it's a pleasure to be the Invincible Company of the Month. What you see here is Bosch's research center in Renningen near Stuttgart. It represents Bosch's history, present, and certainly also the future. Traditionally, our organization has been very successful in the development of new technologies and new products. And certainly, this will also remain so in the future. In the year 2015, something very important happened. Our board of management decided to set up a competence center for business model innovation. The challenge was clear. We had to test many innovation ideas in a fast and capital efficient way. We wanted to find the very few innovation projects which have the potential to scale. Now the question to you, in order to reach that number of 19 innovation projects successfully exiting our Bosch Accelerator program, how many projects entered the validation phase? 19 innovation projects, 3, 108, 214, or even 926. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so I like to ask this question when I give talks to leaders to see if they understand how innovation works. And what's interesting here, if you ask leaders, to get 19 innovation successes, do you invest in 19? Do you invest in 43, 108, 214, or 926? And then because there's a bit of framing, obviously people understand it's not 19 out of 19. But when you look at the processes in most companies, when they invest in a project, they almost expect it to succeed. So you're close to somewhere between 19 or 43. Yet business model innovation has a much, much lower success rate. So you actually have to invest in many, many projects to let the winners emerge, because the winning teams and ideas, you do not pick them, you build an ecosystem for them to emerge. So let's listen to Uwe, what the correct answer is and how you make this ecosystem work so the winning teams and ideas can actually emerge.
Yes, you're right. 214 innovation projects entered our validation engine, our Bosch Accelerator program. You've probably read the book, right? Let me give you some additional information around these 214 innovation projects which entered our Bosch Accelerator program. Phase 1 has an average duration of 3 months, including prep time. The average budget is 120,000 euros per team, and this already includes the personnel costs. After a very short period of time, and as I said, 3 months, we are able to successfully terminate 65% of all innovation projects. The remaining projects, in numbers 74, continued their journey in phase 2 of our program. The average team has a budget of 300,000 euros. And again, this includes, on one hand side, the personnel costs, but also the costs for the development and iteration of the MVP. And again, at the end of phase 2, a high number of innovation projects can be successfully terminated. We believe it's very important to ask the teams themselves whether they believe they're a go or no-go at the end of phase 1 and also at the end of phase 2 of the program, because this really brings responsibility to teams, and this also certainly drives cultural change in an organization. The go criteria, which we derive out of most recent methods and tools, are the foundation for a proper decision whether a team should stop or continue their journey. The success rate of the Bosch Accelerator program is around 10%, meaning that only 10% of the innovation projects are successfully exiting our Bosch Accelerator program. Now, you might argue that's a low number. I would disagree, because in explorative and adjacent innovations, you need to accept that the success rate is reasonably low. The purpose of the Bosch Accelerator program is to find those very few innovation projects which really have the potential to scale. Successful organizations.
Okay, so I'll stop here, but I want you to understand this is the most crucial part that companies get wrong today. So while they often start to get some good, processes going, what they're not very good at today, most companies, is number one here, if you look at how many projects were killed, is a huge rate. 65% are terminated. And what Uwe said, you might not have heard it, is that the teams actually agree with this. So they can't bring evidence to the table. So they're absolutely fine with their projects getting retired. Same thing here, right? So another 74%. So 1 out of 10 is a normal rate. So what I like to say is if a company can't kill 9 out of 10 projects, what you're actually doing is you're condemning the teams to succeed, which means they're going to play it safe and you won't get innovation. So that was a little bit like 30 minutes of insights into 20 years of growth and innovation lessons learned. So Sean, I hope that was a little bit of what you expected. Happy to give some answers. So.
That was amazing. That was absolutely fantastic, Alex. Thanks so much. So guys, I will be monitoring the Q&A here, but I do want to, Alex, start with a couple of questions of my own to get us kicked off here, and then I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. So one thing that I wanted to double click on is, at the beginning, you were talking about this concept of invincible companies, and you talked about, invincible companies having a superior business model, right? Which I think intellectually that resonates with all of us. And then you went through these different business model patterns. I think that the question that jumped to mind as you were going through that today is like, beyond these business model patterns that might point you in the right direction, is there a general sense that you would say to organizations like, hey, these business models tend to be more superior than others? Or is it more contextual, like the right business model for one industry and company may just not be a good business model for another industry in a different sector?
So it's often the question, right? Like, what's the magic bullet? Like, which business model? What's the most successful business model? And I don't think it can be answered that way, because you can go from a transactional business model to one with recurring revenues, but you could also do the other way around. And
Right.
sometimes that makes sense. My favorite example is not from low tech to high tech, but from high tech to lower tech, right? So Nintendo Wii, if you think of that, was a very contrarian move. So the Nintendo, when it was launched, the Nintendo Wii was an inferior technological product, okay, from a platform perspective. The graphics were terrible, the speed was terrible. But what did they do? They kind of had this blue ocean strategy business model approach, where they said, we're going to go for an underserved market of casual gamers. So that's a bigger market. And we're going to use low tech. So off-the-shelf technology, nothing proprietary. So motion control, right? Nintendo Wii, you can play tennis like Roger Federer, Rafa Nadal, was not proprietary. So nobody thought about innovating with an inferior technology, except for Nintendo with the Wii. So they took that off-the-shelf technology and they could lower the cost. So it was actually a low-cost strategy. So sometimes this counterintuitive approach can make a lot of sense. That's why I don't like saying, oh, this is the perfect business model. Of course, there's some that stand out. Building a platform business model, right? I mean, look at iOS and Android. Why are they dominating the world? Because it's very hard to disrupt a platform business model like that. So is there some truth to that? Yep, you want to go for that if you can, but you can't always. So it's not always the feasible solution. So context dependent, you need to ask yourself, which patterns could we apply? What configuration could we mix together at a certain moment in time, in a certain industry configuration, with a certain technology or a certain market opportunity? So I think it's really important not to think about the magic bullet, but the silver bullet, but to go and understand business models so you can design the right one at the right time. And that's an ability that entrepreneurs intuitively have. But you know what? Now we can make it more explicit. We can codify it in the way that anybody can become as good as the best entrepreneurs out there who already have a sense, a natural sense of business model innovation. It's like some athletes have better DNA. That doesn't mean they're going to be the most successful ones. Those who actually train harder and more systematically are probably going to win.
I think there's a lot of brilliance in that, right? Like a lot of these things people don't realize that great entrepreneurs have been doing for a long time. But as we kind of codify this and come up with processes, right, you're doing two things. You're scaling up the number of people who can do this. And I think you're also shortening the time and the sort of scar tissue that it takes to learn to be one of those kind of great entrepreneurs, right? Which I think is absolutely incredible. I have another question. No, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Alex, go ahead.
Can I build on this for a second? Because obviously, we came up with some of these tools and, combined it with the whole lean startup approach and customer development. So I would always ask successful entrepreneurs. And I think the first time I asked this question was Steve Blank, and we became very good friends. I asked him, well, Steve, you've been super successful. Why do you need these tools? And he said, well, look, I would have done it way faster, much faster, and with much less scar tissue. So he became a great entrepreneur through trial and error. And, over time, he got better at this. So you can speed up this by learning it faster. It's like any profession. You can learn innovation and entrepreneurship, and you'll do it much faster. It is not because, we didn't, today we have medicine, though it doesn't mean now we're going to teach, knee surgery in an intuitive way and just say, hey, go out, do a couple of workshops, practice a bit, and now you're ready to become a surgeon. So today we have good methods. This is where we are in entrepreneurship and innovation. We're becoming surgeons with the same kinds of tools and processes. Of course, there's always an art to it. So entrepreneurship is art and science. But we are now really starting to master the scientific part. We can measure the reduction of risk and uncertainty. So what was good 5 years ago in this field of innovation is just not good enough anymore. We're learning really fast.
Yeah, that's right. And we see it like when I think about, early stage companies, just the increase in the success that they get through this. And I remember whenever Four Steps to Epiphany originally came out, it was just like opening this book and oh my gosh, these are we're putting vocabulary to things that I've observed for a long time. I have another question, but one of the questions in the chat, I think, ties into what you're just talking about, Alex. So we'll jump into that first. And then, so when David Ross is asking some questions around sort of the methods you use to test these patterns that you've identified. And then are there, objective measures for evaluating patterns in their performance here?
So when it comes to patterns, you can look at, there's basic questions like, recurring revenue versus transaction revenues. At the end of the day, that's the design. So it's not enough, right? That's why we go through that double loop. We need to go as fast as possible, getting out of the red bubble, the design bubble, into the test bubble, right? And that's where we just got a little bit more systematic, built on the shoulder of giants, right? Saying, well, okay, first thing you do is make the hypothesis of your business model explicit. What are all of the things that would need to be true for this wonderful pattern to work, right? Okay, this, and this. And then you start to prioritize which ones to test, and then you start to learn. So I wouldn't get too hung up with testing the business design. I just go for one, look at the pattern, see, okay, market sizing, etc., but then immediately go into the testing. And what's important in this case, if I just can quickly go back to our double loop. So let me go back here. What's important is to understand this is a process that you go through all the time. So you go through this all the time. So you test as if you were wrong, and based on what you learn, you might actually go back to the red part, right? So it's not like, oh, I designed and then I'm just going to validate how smart I was. That's not how things work, right? Unfortunately, otherwise, it'd be easy to do entrepreneurship. You go through this double loop again and again and again as an entrepreneur and innovator, probably 24 hours a day. And you're always thinking about patterns here, and you're always thinking about how could I test that here and what evidence do I have? And it's not like a process where it's on off. You gradually learn more. You're going to get better understanding of customer. You're going to, work on the value proposition. All of a sudden you realize, damn, that customer segment I was into actually doesn't have a budget. You need to pivot to a new customer segment. Everything that you just learned is useless. So in innovation and entrepreneurship, there's a backward part as well, where you actually go back to square one. It's very unfortunate, but that's what's different with execution projects, where you can ask, are you on time and on budget? But I would just emphasize, don't get stuck in the red, but don't get stuck in the testing either, because we see a lot of teams, they just test. No. You go through this all the time, and gradually you're going to understand in which direction to go. And what's cool is we now know how to measure how risky an idea is and how much we de-risked it based on the type of evidence the team gathered.
Yeah, that's amazing. So one more question on this, and then I want to give you a sort of change gears and give you a curveball unless other questions come in on the chat. But so one of the things I think that's important, this is sort of from David again, is the size of the prize. If you end up, looking at a number of these different ones, and if you're thinking about going from 214 down to 74, down to 19, right? Some of those are because of validated learnings and unlearning and things that also don't prove to be false. But some of those are also the market opportunity may just not be big enough for a company like Bosch to invest in. So how do you think about that in your overall part of the process of evaluating these ideas?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And we actually get people to think numbers from the start, in the sense that you put numbers on paper, but then you immediately say, we don't know. Like, okay, this is a $250 million opportunity or $1 billion opportunity, but you don't actually know if it's going to work. So everybody looks at the numbers and said, okay, it's fantasy. Now you go and start to test the pricing. Okay, well, 20% are willing to pay this price. Nobody's willing to go beyond this. Can't do it because it's cannibalizing a different product. So you'll kill it. So you have to be willing to kill projects again and again and again based on the criteria you set. Sometimes that can be market size. Sometimes that can be margin. So what's really important at the beginning is that you define the criteria. I remember working on a project with an oral care company, and they were saying, okay, well, if we don't reach 1 billion people, we're not going to pursue this opportunity. So you just need to set the criteria from the start, and then really be willing to kill projects if you don't meet those criteria. And you kill them not based on opinion, but you kill them based on evidence, right? That's the most important here to understand. You never kill projects based on the most important business card and the person's opinion, but you kill projects based on evidence that exists or not. right? If you don't have enough evidence, kill the project, or give them another, 3 weeks. Okay, come up with the evidence and we'll be willing to invest. But if you can't produce the evidence, you really need to have a very good reason to go on, because if you do continue to invest in a project that can't produce the evidence, you're actually undermining the entire credibility of the system, and people won't believe you anymore that you're making evidence-based investments. So that's where leaders come in. Leaders of a company, their task is not to pick ideas. Their task is not even to invest in the best ideas. It's their task is to build an ecosystem where the company continuously explores and only invests in projects that produce enough evidence. So you're building a little bit of a venture capital system inside of your company. And you might even mix it with corporate venture capital. You might even mix it with external teams. So you're just expanding the toolbox. And it doesn't mean because you're exploring that you need to grow them organically. I know a ton of companies, they explore, they learn, and then they acquire. So you'll make better acquisitions because you learn. So it doesn't mean because you're exploring, you will organically grow, because you go much faster if you buy pieces, if you buy the whole thing, or you make investments. But you won't make good investments if you haven't learned enough. That's the challenge, right?
Yeah, just to double click on that, I am convinced people are basically systematically underutilizing each of those three activities by thinking of them as distinct activities, right? CVC plus external innovation plus internal innovation, the sum is way greater than the parts. There.
And that's a really important thing that you mentioned, because today, I mean, we work with some of the most amazing companies in the world, but it shows this is an emerging discipline. Often corporate venture capital lives over here, the innovation strategy is over here, and they're completely disconnected. Like, that just can't be. And then you have acquisitions over here. Those need to be integrated, tools in your toolbox that are driven by the same strategy, and they're all aligned and they all work into the same direction. This is not the case yet in most of the companies we work with. They're seen as distinctive things in different parts of the business. And as you said, I think there's a huge opportunity there to just align them. Your performance will go through the roof.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's a thing we've been kind of banging the drum on recently. I think this was a really important red thread here. Okay, I do want to ask you a question, because I'm looking at who's a couple of the other folks who are on the chat, and I know they're people that are kind of at this point in their career where they're contemplating, do I go jump in and do a startup, or do I go work at a place like Bosch and join? And Bosch is a great partner of ours, so that's not just a hypothetical. Like, do I join a company like Bosch, which is amazing, or do I go, do a for lack of a better term, kind of traditional startup? And so I guess I was, Alex, you've been an entrepreneur. You've also certainly helped a lot of the world's great companies do this. If you were advising somebody maybe, in their early to mid 20s, thinking about what that next step is, how would you kind of frame that out? And then I do have a follow-up on this as well, but answer that first, if you don't mind.
So I think it's great to, join a startup maybe before you create your own, because you're going to learn a lot, and you might want to learn on somebody else's wallet, and because it can get very expensive. Like, I made all the mistakes with the strategizing myself. It cost me a lot of money. I won't mention any numbers. We survived. That's the good news. But there's also, when you do decide to go into corporations, you can do things that you can't necessarily do the same way in the startup world, because I believe corporations have incredible assets, right? They have a brand, they have technology, they have patents, they have access to customers. So Steve Blank likes to say, what do companies have that startups don't have? Customers, right? So unfortunately, they also have a lot of roadblocks. But here's how I would frame it. If you're looking at a corporation to join, there are 3 questions you want to ask. Let me go here. 3 questions that you want to ask to see, is this a company that actually is able to innovate or not? Because you don't want to go into a company that can't say yes to these 3 questions I'm going to give you, because if you can't say yes to this, they're not going to be able to innovate. First one is time. How much time does the CEO spend on innovation? And I put the minimum at 40%. When the CEO doesn't personally spend 40% of their time on innovation, innovation will not happen. And at the most progressive companies, I'll take a Chinese example. China not so popular at the moment, of course, but Ping An has a CEO, a co-CEO who just focuses on innovation. Jessica Tan was actually elected one of the greatest leaders, women leaders these days, because she led Ping An, in innovation, co-CEO with execution innovation. That's number one. Then power. Where does innovation live in the org chart? So if you have a CEO who spends 40% of their time on innovation, you need somebody at the next level. We like to call this chief entrepreneur, who spends 100% of their time on innovation. So if that position is not at the very top of the org chart, innovation will not happen, because in innovation, it's actually not a money challenge today, it's a power challenge. If innovation has money but no power, it's not going to happen, right? And then 3 is, can we kill this should be a skull. It's like how I draw a skull. Sorry for that. Can you kill 9 out of 10 projects in order to create 1 out of 10 as a winner? Okay. If you can't do that, what does that mean? Teams are condemned to succeed. So you get into an accelerator, you have to win. Guess what you're going to do? You're going to play it safe because you're risking your career. But if you're closer to Bosch and you can explore, and it's okay to fail, because failure doesn't necessarily mean, you didn't do a good job. It means you've been too early or the market is too small, and that's okay. If you don't have these 3 things, innovation will not happen. So CEO who spends time on innovation has power and the ability to kill projects. So this is what I would look at before I would join a company in an innovation role. Because if this is not the case, it's going to be an uphill battle, because innovation happens bottom up with top-down support. So these are the 3 things I look at when I look at any company to see if they're able to innovate or not. And it's really, really easy to assess.
That's hugely helpful. That's a great framework. So I got a question via text from someone who's dialing in. I don't know if they can't get the QA, but the question via text here is, when should companies start thinking about I assume this is kind of progression from startup to mature company, but when should companies start thinking about having a portfolio of business models versus exploiting the original business model that got them started?
So I think it's hard to generalize. I mean, I like to use one example where it wasn't actually portfolio, but it was a phased approach. So think Netflix, right? When they started out, they already wanted to do streaming. They knew it was way too early. So there was this distant business model, streaming, which was on the mind of the founders, but they asked, well, how can we learn fast? They almost died in the process. Like the company almost died in the process with DVD by mail. But so if you have this distant vision, you can still work on an intermediary business model to get into the market. And in their case, they even disrupted the entire market. So sometimes you don't need to think portfolio, but you need to think business model evolution already, right? You have this really crazy goal. What's the intermediary model? To a certain extent, that's what my company is doing. We have this crazy goal. Luckily, we did go for an intermediary model, because otherwise we'd be dead by now. So now we're a profitable company, but working on this next wave. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is while you are once you've found a business model, you should already start to think explore again, because it's happening really fast these days. And I don't have the scientific research on it, but it's pretty impressive to see that the shelf life of business models is getting shorter. And startups have to think about new business models while they're scaling the one they have. What you shouldn't do is, when you haven't found one yet, don't focus on anything else than finding one, right? But once you've found one and you're scaling that, you probably want to slowly start thinking other stuff. And the less your business model has moats, the faster you should start. I mean, think of, GoPro. GoPro had no protection to their business model. I mean, it already took them pretty long until they found a scalable one. But once they scaled, they didn't put enough energy into finding that new business model. It's not that they didn't try. So again, don't want to diss the team there, but they didn't try hard enough to find that other business model while they were scaling. And that's unfortunately the tendency at all companies I see. They're so focused on scaling, because scaling is hard. Scaling is very hard, but you almost forget, because you're so focused on scaling, but I don't think you can afford to not to neglect the next phase. So more companies than not actually neglect that next phase, but it doesn't have to be a huge investment. So I think you should start rather early. I don't think companies are starting early enough yet.
So I'm going to just sort of push for a minute to get a little more specific here, Alex, and then we can kind of give you a moment to wrap up whatever you want. But if I were sort of trying to contextualize that, I think your point around moats is really key here. Like the more moats the business model has, the better. But if you were trying to generalize that, it feels more like when you're at single-digit millions of revenue than when you're at double-digit millions of revenue is when you should, in general, begin to exploit this, but probably greater than a million of revenue. Is that like, if you're trying to kind of give a heuristic, does that feel right to you, or would you frame it differently?
I'll be honest, I have a hard time generalizing because it really depends on the context, right? So some industries are just much faster than others. So you will have to almost from, the moment you found a business model that's working, you already really have to seriously think about the next wave. And in other industries, it's a bit calmer, right? You're still scaling one, you have more time. So I have a hard time generalizing because it's so context dependent. What it does mean, so we like to talk about disruption risk. So we didn't go into this at all, and we do this mainly for large companies, but one thing you can look at is how large is the disruption risk? So if there's a lot of venture capital flowing into this arena, there are already a lot of competitors, it's already been a space where innovation has been very fast, then the disruption risk is extremely high. So I think the best bet you have is let's measure the disruption risk, and that will put pressure on how fast we have to rethink our business model.
Okay, I like that. Okay, last question, and then we'll get everybody out of here on time and honor your time, Alex. But you are, I mentioned this at the beginning, you're number 4 top 50 thinker. Many would argue number 1 top business thinker out there. So you're always thinking about kind of what's around the corner. What do you think is like next for innovation and the kind of space that you live in?
I think the biggest one is management innovation. So I'm already, people like Gary Hamel, so they write about that, but I think this is now happening, right? So you don't get business model innovation. You don't get, systematic new growth and innovation if you don't work on the management system. So I think just this explore, the ambidextrous organization is more paper and theory today than reality, but this is happening, right? So I think that shift, and thinking of, again, unfortunately, a Chinese company that comes to mind, Haier, it's extremely decentralized. So they have 4,000 micro enterprises that are constantly reinventing themselves. So think of it, that's decentralization to the extreme. So I think management innovation is gonna really, really push us, because without management innovation, we're not going to get, more value creation. So I do think that's a big one. And then, this old topic of war, and it's never good to use the word war in particular in today's context, but the fight for great talent is actually getting harder, because if today you can't show how you're creating value, not just for your company, but also for society and employees, right? You're going to lose talent. So, and that again goes back to management innovation. You need to create better companies today with better ways of working. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to retain some of the best innovation talent. So I think this is something we're really seeing today. Innovation talent is moving out to the startup world, unfortunately, because I think value creation at scale is really possible in large companies if they get their act together and become innovation machines.
I like both of those a lot. That's good. Okay, well, this has been, the highlight. These are always kind of highlights of my time, Alex. So I appreciate you making time available. For those of you who enjoyed this, keep in mind we've got the forum on November 16th in Pittsburgh. For those of you who are local, I will also slice this up and share the videos afterwards, so that if you have colleagues who you think should have seen this. And for the students, hopefully when you step back into the classroom coming out of fall break here, and you're working on using your business model canvas to organize your thoughts, hopefully there's some additional things now that you can think about. This question, I'd encourage you to think about, the moats around the concepts that you have in mind. I think that's a really new one. And I also think this concept of disruption risk is kind of a new thing that you should bring back into the classroom in the second half of the semester here. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap up the webinar, Alex, but I really appreciate your time today. Thanks everybody for joining. And Alex, thank you so much. With that, we can end the webinar here.
Thanks for having me. Bye.